The glass doors of the office swung open at 9:02 in the morning, and the woman standing there wore a coat that cost more than Mara Jensen's annual rent. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling around a small pink backpack. "Are you the one who found her yesterday?" she asked, voice breaking. Mara nodded slowly, confused. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I need you to understand something," she said, stepping closer. "That little girl you walked home is my entire world. And I don't think you understand yet who I am, or what I'm about to offer you. If stories about small kindnesses turning into life-changing moments move you, stay to the end, because this one will stay with you long after it's over. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one." Mara Jensen had never wanted much out of life beyond a quiet apartment, a steady paycheck, and enough peace at the end of the day to fall asleep without her mind racing. She was 34 years old, worked as an administrative assistant at a small accounting firm on the third floor of a converted brick building downtown, and lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment 11 blocks away that she had decorated slowly over years. With furniture she'd found second-hand and photographs of a life that had once included more people in it than it did now. She had been married once briefly in her late 20s to a man who left before their second anniversary, and after that she had built a life that didn't depend on anyone showing up. She walked to work most mornings along the same route, past the same bakery, the same dry cleaner, the same corner where a retired man named Otto sold newspapers out of a folding chair, even though almost nobody bought newspapers anymore. She liked the predictability of it. She liked knowing at any given hour of the day exactly where she was supposed to be and exactly what was expected of her. It was a small life, by most people's standards, but it was hers, and she had made a kind of peace with its smallness that had taken her years to arrive at. The Tuesday everything changed started like any other. Rain had been threatening all afternoon, the sky over the city turning the color of wet concrete, and Mara left the office a few minutes early to beat the worst of it, cutting through the small public park 2 blocks from her apartment instead of taking her usual route along the avenue. She almost didn't take the shortcut. It had been drizzling on and off for an hour, and the park at that time of evening was mostly empty except for a few joggers hurrying to finish their laps before the sky opened up completely. She almost didn't see the little girl at all. She was sitting alone on a bench near the fountain, small enough that her feet didn't reach the ground, wearing a yellow raincoat 2 sizes too big and clutching a small pink backpack against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Myra noticed her the way you notice something slightly wrong in a familiar picture, not immediately alarming, but enough to make you slow down and look twice. She almost kept walking. She told herself later in the days that followed that she almost kept walking, the way people do when they see something that isn't quite their business and hope someone else will handle it. But something about the stillness of the girl stopped her, not crying, not calling out, just sitting very straight on the bench with the particular practiced calm of a child who has been taught not to make a scene, even when she is frightened. Mara crossed the wet grass and crouched down a few feet away, keeping her voice soft, the way you'd approach a bird that might startle. "Hey there," she said. "Are you here with someone?" The girl looked up at her with enormous dark eyes and shook her head just once, and then very quietly she said, "I don't know where my mommy went." It took Mara almost 20 minutes to get the girl to say anything more than a handful of words. Her name was Ivy. She was 6. She had been at the park with her nanny, she said, but the nanny had gotten a phone call and told her to wait right on this bench, right here, and don't move, and that had been a long time ago, longer than Ivy could measure in anything but the growing ache of being forgotten. Mara sat beside her on the wet bench, not touching her, not rushing her, and asked simple, careful questions. "What's your nanny's name? Do you know your address? Do you have a phone number memorized?" And got mostly silence or half-answers in return. The disoriented fragments of a child who had been raised comfortably enough that getting lost had never once crossed into the realm of things she'd been prepared for. Rain started falling in earnest, and Mara made a decision she would replay in her mind many times over the following days. She took off her own coat, wrapped it gently around Ivy's already covered shoulders anyway, and told her they were going to find somewhere warm and dry to figure this out together. She didn't call the police immediately, and later she would question that decision too, turning it over every possible way it could have gone wrong. But something about the girl's calm, careful manner, the way she clutched the backpack, the quality of her clothes even beneath the oversized raincoat, the faint, expensive scent of her hair, told Mara this was a child who belonged somewhere very specific, somewhere that would be turned upside down with panic the moment anyone noticed she was missing, and that the fastest path back to safety wasn't necessarily through a system built for strangers, but through patience. She walked Ivy the 2 blocks to her own apartment, called the local precinct from her landline the moment they were inside, out of the rain, and gave a calm, detailed report. What the girl looked like, where she'd been found, every detail Ivy had managed to share. The officer on the line told her a report of a missing child hadn't yet come in from that area, which unsettled Mara more than it reassured her. If a 6-year-old had gone missing from a park in this city, someone should have already been looking. She made Ivy a cup of hot chocolate she wasn't sure a 6-year-old should be drinking that late, found an old cartoon on her television that seemed to calm the girl slightly, and sat with her on the couch while the rain hammered against the windows, trying every gentle question she could think of to coax out more information. Ivy mentioned, at one point, almost offhandedly, a building with a garden on the roof, and a driver named Samuel who always had mints in the car, and a school with a name Mara didn't recognize but made a note of anyway. None of it amounted to an address. What it amounted to, slowly, unmistakably, was the outline of a life far more comfortable than anything Mara had ever personally known. A life with drivers and rooftop gardens and private schools. A life that made the sight of this particular little girl alone on a park bench in the rain feel even stranger than it already had. It was almost 2 hours later, with Mara beginning to seriously consider driving Ivy to the precinct herself, that her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, a woman's voice on the other end, tight with barely controlled panic, asking in a rush whether she had, by any chance, found a little girl in a yellow raincoat near the fountain in Grant Park. The precinct had apparently cross-referenced Mara's earlier call with a report that had just come in, filed nearly 90 minutes after the fact by a frantic nanny who'd finally worked up the courage to call the child's mother directly instead of continuing to search on her own. Mara said yes, she had Ivy. Ivy was safe. Ivy was warm and fed and watching cartoons on her couch, and the sound the woman made on the other end of the line was somewhere between a sob and a laugh, the specific sound of relief so total it physically hurts coming out. The woman arrived at Mara's apartment building 40 minutes later in a black car that looked entirely out of place on that particular street. And when she came through the door, she didn't say anything at all at first. She simply crossed the small living room in 3 steps and dropped to her knees in front of the couch, pulling Ivy into her arms so tightly the girl made a small, surprised sound. And for almost a full minute nobody in the room said a single word. Mara stood near the kitchen doorway, feeling suddenly like an intruder in her own home, watching a mother hold her child the way you hold something you were certain, an hour ago, you might never hold again. When the woman finally looked up, her makeup was streaked, her composure clearly hanging by a thread, and she introduced herself simply as Renee. She thanked Mara in a voice choked with emotion, asked exactly what had happened, listened to every detail with an intensity that made Mara feel, briefly, like the most important person in the world, and then, almost as an afterthought, exchanged phone numbers with her before gathering Ivy's things and carrying her, half asleep already, back out to the waiting car. Mara stood at her window and watched the black car pull away into the wet street, and told herself quietly that this had probably been the strangest and most meaningful evening of her year, and that it was, in all likelihood, now finished. She had no way of knowing, standing there in her doorway with a cooling mug of chocolate still on the coffee table, that the woman she'd just met was Renee Ashford, the founder and CEO of Ashford Vale Holdings, one of the largest privately held investment firms on the entire eastern seaboard, a woman whose name appeared regularly in financial publications, whose net worth was estimated in the billions, and whose daughter's safety had, for the past 90 minutes, consumed the full attention of a private security team that was, even now, reviewing footage and preparing a report that would eventually land on desks far above anything Mara Jensen would ever have reason to know about. Mara knew none of this. To her, Renee had simply been a terrified mother in an expensive coat, and Ivy had simply been a frightened little girl on a park bench. She went to bed that night thinking mostly about how tired she was, and how glad she felt that the evening had ended the way it had, and didn't think, even once, about what might come next. The knock on her office door came the following morning at exactly 9 minutes past 9, while Mara was halfway through her second cup of coffee and a stack of invoices that needed sorting before 10. Her supervisor, A mild, easily flustered man named Gerald poked his head into the small back office where Mara worked and told her, with an expression she couldn't quite read, that there was someone in the lobby asking for her by name. Mara assumed it was a client, gathered her notepad out of habit, and walked out to the small reception area and stopped short at the sight of Renee Ashford standing there in the middle of the modest little lobby, looking entirely out of place among the worn carpet and the outdated furniture, her eyes red-rimmed, holding Ivy's small pink backpack against her chest like she hadn't been able to put it down since the night before. "Are you the one who found her yesterday?" Renee asked, though she clearly already knew the answer, her voice thinner and more fragile than it had been the night before, when adrenaline had carried her through the reunion itself. Mara nodded, glancing at Gerald, who was hovering near his own office door pretending not to watch. "I need you to understand something," Renee said, stepping closer, close enough that Mara could see the exhaustion beneath her carefully applied makeup, the sleepless night written into the fine lines around her eyes. "That little girl you walked home is my entire world. She's the only thing in my entire life I have never once been willing to compromise on." She paused, visibly gathering herself. "And I don't think you understand yet who I am or what I'm about to offer you." Mara felt a strange, dislodging sensation, the feeling of standing on ground that was suddenly less solid than it had seemed a moment earlier. "I don't need anything," she said carefully. "I was glad to help. Anyone would have done the same thing." Renee's expression shifted into something almost sad. "No," she said quietly. "They wouldn't have. Do you have any idea how many people walk past a lost child every single day in this city and decide it isn't their responsibility? Ivy could tell me exactly what happened last night in more detail than most adults could manage. She told me you didn't call the police first and hand her over to strangers. You brought her somewhere warm. You gave her your coat. You sat with her and asked her questions gently instead of frightening her with urgency. You made her feel safe before you made yourself feel finished with the problem." She said the last part with a particular emphasis, as if it were the detail that had kept her awake most of the night, turning it over. "That's not a small thing, Miss Jensen. That's a rare thing." Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, and Renee seemed to take the silence as permission to continue. She explained, in a voice that grew steadier as she spoke, that she wanted to properly thank Mara, not with an envelope of cash pressed awkwardly into her hand in a lobby. She said, watching Mara's face carefully as though anticipating the assumption, but with a conversation over lunch, somewhere private, where she could actually explain what she had in mind. Mara hesitated, some old, careful instinct telling her that stepping any further into this world would change something about her life that she wasn't sure she wanted changed. But there was something in Renee's face, not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude, but something closer to recognition, the look of someone who has spent a great deal of her life surrounded by people who wanted things from her and had just, for the first time in longer than she could remember, met someone who hadn't wanted anything at all. That made her agree. They met 2 days later at a small, quiet restaurant Mara had never heard of, tucked into a converted townhouse a few blocks from Ashford Vale's headquarters, the kind of place that didn't advertise and didn't need to. Renee arrived without the entourage Mara half expected, just herself, dressed more simply than she had been in Mara's office, and she spent the first 20 minutes of their lunch not talking business at all, but asking Mara real questions about her job, her apartment, how long she'd lived in the city, whether she had family nearby. Mara found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, opening up more than she usually did with strangers, telling Renee about her small, quiet life, her preference for routine, the marriage that hadn't worked out, and the peace she'd slowly built in its absence. Renee listened the way Marcus had listened to Evelyn in a different story entirely, without interrupting, without rushing to fill silences, the particular listening of someone who had learned, through long experience, that most people eventually tell you the truth if you simply give them room to. It was only over coffee that Renee finally turned the conversation toward what she'd actually come to say. She explained, carefully, that Ivy's nanny, the woman who had left her alone on that bench, had been let go, not out of cruelty, she said, but because the incident had exposed something Renee had been uneasy about for months and had simply never acted on. A pattern of small carelessness that Renee's own packed schedule had made it too easy to overlook. She told Mara that she needed someone new, not exactly a nanny in the traditional sense, but someone who could manage Ivy's schedule, oversee her care, coordinate between the household staff and Ivy's school and her various activities, someone who was organized, calm under pressure, And this was the part Renee said she cared about more than any resume line. Someone who would treat Ivy like a person worth protecting rather than a responsibility to be managed. "I watched you with her for less than an hour," Renee said, "and I learned more about your character than I've learned about people I've worked with for a decade." She named a salary that made Mara's coffee cup pause halfway to her mouth, a number nearly triple what she made at the accounting firm, along with housing considerations and benefits that sounded almost fictional next to the modest, careful budget Mara had lived within for years. Mara sat with the offer for a long moment, turning it over, feeling the particular vertigo of being handed something that could genuinely change the entire shape of her life in a single conversation. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to let herself be swept into a life with fewer worries in it, and part of her, the same careful, self-protective part that had built her small, quiet apartment and her small, quiet routines after her marriage ended, hesitated, wary of a decision made too quickly, wary of stepping into a world with rules she didn't yet understand. She told Renee she needed time to think, and Renee, to her credit, didn't push. "Take whatever time you need," she said. "I'm not offering this because I feel like I owe you something transactional. I'm offering it because Ivy asked about you twice yesterday, and because in 11 years of employing people to be near my daughter, I have never once felt the specific certainty I felt watching her fall asleep on your couch." Mara went home that night and sat for a long time at her small kitchen table, the one piece of furniture she'd bought new rather than second-hand, and thought about her life the way you think about a familiar room you've lived in so long you've stopped really seeing it. She thought about the invoices waiting for her at the office, the same route to work every morning, the particular comfort of knowing exactly what each day would hold. She thought, too, about the weight of Ivy's small hand gripping her sleeve in the rain, about the way the girl had looked at her across the coffee table 2 nights running, with an expression that seemed to be asking, quietly, whether Mara might be someone worth trusting again. She thought about the marriage that had ended, and the years she'd spent afterward building a life deliberately small enough that nothing in it could hurt her the way that ending had. She wondered, sitting there, whether smallness had become less a piece she'd chosen, and more a wall she'd built without quite noticing, and whether this strange, sudden offer might be less a disruption of her careful life and more an invitation out of it. She called Renee 3 days later and said yes, and the weeks that followed unfolded faster than she'd expected, a blur of paperwork and introductions, and a move into a guest wing of the Ashford estate that felt, for the first several nights, more like visiting a museum than living in a home. Ivy, for her part, seemed to settle into the arrangement with the easy, uncomplicated trust that children carry when adults have earned it honestly, following Mara from room to room in those first days, asking her 100 small questions, testing in the particular way children test, whether this new person in her life was going to stay steady or eventually disappear the way the last one had. Mara made a point from the very first week of being exactly as steady as she'd promised. She kept the same calm, unhurried patience she'd shown on that park bench, applied now to bedtime routines and homework and the small daily negotiations of a child's life. And slowly, over the course of the first month, she watched something in Ivy loosen and open that had been carefully guarded since the night she'd been left alone in the rain. It wasn't an easy adjustment, and Mara never pretended it was. Ashford Vale was a world with its own unspoken rules, its own hierarchy of staff and family, its own particular loneliness that came with proximity to enormous wealth without actually belonging to it. There were moments in those first months when Mara felt entirely out of place, standing in rooms full of Renee's colleagues and associates, aware that her presence was tolerated rather than fully understood, aware that some of the household staff eyed her with a wariness that suggested they were waiting to see how long this particular arrangement would last before it collapsed the way, she gathered, others had before it. She didn't let it change how she treated Ivy. She showed up every single day with the same steady patience, and slowly, the wariness around her began to soften, replaced by something like respect, the specific respect people develop for someone who does a difficult job consistently well without ever needing to be praised for it. Renee, for her part, kept a careful distance in those early weeks, unwilling to hover, unwilling to make Mara feel watched or tested. But Mara noticed in small ways that Renee was paying closer attention than she let on, arriving home a little earlier some evenings just to catch the tail end of Ivy's bedtime routine, lingering in doorways to watch Mara read to her daughter in a voice that had, without either of them quite noticing when, become genuinely warm rather than merely careful. 3 months in, Renee asked Mara to join her for coffee one evening after Ivy had gone to sleep, not as an employer checking in on an employee, but simply as two people sharing a quiet moment at the end of a long day. And Mara realized, sitting across from her in the enormous, softly lit kitchen, that something had shifted between them that neither of them had quite named yet. Not quite friendship, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Built slowly out of shared worry and shared relief, and the particular intimacy of two women who both, in their own ways, had learned to be careful with their trust. It was around the 5th month that the first real test came, the kind of moment that reveals whether an arrangement built on gratitude can hold up under something harder than gratitude. Ivy came down with a sudden, frightening fever late one night while Renee was 3 states away at a board meeting she couldn't leave, and Mara spent 6 hours in the emergency room alone with a terrified 6-year-old, making decisions, signing forms, holding Ivy's hand through tests that clearly scared her, calling Renee every hour with calm, precise updates even as her own hands shook slightly between calls. By the time Renee's flight landed and she rushed straight from the airport to the hospital, Ivy's fever had broken and she was sleeping peacefully, curled against Mara's side in the narrow hospital bed, and Renee stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the two of them before she said anything at all. "I've had a dozen people manage logistics for my daughter over the years," she said quietly, once Mara had stepped out into the hallway to give her privacy with Ivy. "I have never had anyone manage a crisis for her the way you just did. Calm the entire time, never once panicking on the phone, even though I could hear how frightened you must have been." She looked at Mara with an expression that had shed, entirely, whatever careful distance had remained between them since the beginning. "I don't think I've properly told you what it means to me, knowing she has someone like you in her corner when I can't be there myself." The months that followed deepened into something neither Mara nor Renee had expected when this had all started with a phone call about a lost little girl in a yellow raincoat. Mara found herself, almost without noticing the transition, becoming something closer to family than staff, invited to sit with Renee and Ivy during quiet weekend mornings, consulted on decisions about Ivy's school and her activities not as an employee reporting information upward, but as someone whose judgment Renee had come to trust as fully as her own. She kept her small apartment for the first year, unwilling to let go entirely of the life she'd built alone, but she found herself spending fewer and fewer nights there, the guest wing at the estate slowly becoming less a temporary arrangement and more, simply, home. Ivy, who had once clutched a pink backpack alone on a park bench with the particular stillness of a child, who has learned not to expect anyone to come back for her, grew over that year into a little girl who ran the length of the house shouting Mara's name the moment she came through the door each evening, who no longer flinched at the sound of an unfamiliar car in the driveway, who had, somewhere in the accumulation of 1,000 small, steady days, learned to trust that the people around her would stay. On the 1-year anniversary of the evening Mara found her on that bench in the rain, Renee organized a quiet dinner, just the 3 of them, in the smaller of the estate's 2 dining rooms, the one that actually felt like it belonged to a family rather than a boardroom. Ivy, now 7, presented Mara with a drawing she'd made at school, 2 figures holding hands under a yellow umbrella, rain falling around them in careful crayon lines, and beneath it in a child's uneven handwriting, the words "You found me." Mara held the drawing for a long moment, feeling something rise in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel fully in longer than she could remember, and when she looked up, Renee was watching her with an expression that had, somewhere in the past year, become something Mara would have once been embarrassed to call love, but no longer was. "I think about that night constantly," Renee said, once Ivy had gone off to get ready for bed, leaving the 2 of them alone at the table. "Not the fear of it, though God knows I think about that too. I think about how easily it could have gone differently. If you'd been 10 minutes later leaving your office, if you'd taken your usual route instead of cutting through the park, if you'd been the kind of person who saw a lost child and decided it wasn't your problem to solve." She shook her head slowly. "I've spent my entire career making decisions based on probability and risk, and I have never once been able to make peace with how much of the most important night of my life came down to nothing more than the kind of person you happen to be, in a moment when nobody was watching to see whether you'd stop." Mara thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed, about the strange, quiet architecture of the life she'd built almost by accident, out of a decision that had taken her less than a second to make on a rainy evening a year earlier. She thought about the small, careful world she'd constructed after her marriage ended, The walls she'd built to keep herself safe from being hurt again. And how completely, without her ever quite deciding to, those walls had come down, not through any dramatic reckoning, but simply through the slow, steady accumulation of showing up, day after day, for a little girl who had needed someone too. She still walks through that same park sometimes, on quiet evenings when she wants to remember. The bench by the fountain is still there, unremarkable, the kind of ordinary place where nothing is supposed to happen and everything once did. She doesn't need reminding of what happened there. But she goes anyway sometimes, just to stand for a moment in the place where her life quietly and irreversibly changed, and to remember that the biggest turns in a life rarely announce themselves in advance. They arrive disguised as small, unremarkable choices, stopping instead of walking past, staying instead of leaving, choosing in a single ordinary moment to treat someone else's crisis as though it were your own. She learned that lesson on a rainy bench beside a fountain, holding the hand of a frightened little girl in a yellow raincoat, and she has never once, in all the time since, forgotten it. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that the smallest act of kindness can quietly reshape an entire life, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe for more stories like this one, because you never know which ordinary moment in your own life might turn out to be the one that changes everything.